I do some consulting work on American
feeling in the room was
You
palpable.
don't ever say to her that
What about the Chicago incident?
Introductory discussion on the ethical
we laughed
for the community.
before China took back over.
currently doing in autism.
As a young black violinist, Aaron Dworkin knew firsthand how little diversity existed in the concert hall. That led him to establish the Sphinx organization, a nonprofit dedicated to addressing the stark underrepresentation of people of color in classical music. Each year, the Sphinx organization awards upwards of $1 million in prizes and scholarships, impacting the lives of more than 100,000 students. Dworkin currently serves as the dean of the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance. We'll talk with him about passion, about why we need more diversity in the arts, and about his family roots. Here's our conversation with Aaron Dworkin. Aaron Dworkin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
This past July, you stepped down as president of Sphinx to become the dean of the University of Michigan School of Music, Theater, and Dance. Of course, you founded Sphinx back in 1996 to increase minority involvement in classical music. But the University of Michigan is your alma mater, so in some respects it was a homecoming. Nonetheless, I'm wondering how difficult it was to leave the organization you brought to life.
It was definitely a difficult decision, but really not a hard one in many ways. And I think that's for a couple of reasons. One, the excitement about being able to rejoin the Michigan community, to be able to come back and to have an impact on an institution that had so much of an impact on my own life. But also because I had a very high level of confidence that Sphinx could not only continue with the work that we have been doing, but potentially even go in areas that I couldn't even bring the organization. So I had spent a fair amount of time working on sustainability, on a strong succession plan. So I definitely was able to enter into that decision with a high level of confidence about Sphinx.
And we should add that your wife, Afa, who has been with the organization from the very beginning, is now at the helm.
Yes, and so I was very excited when the board of directors made that ultimate determination. And Afa was actually Sphinx's first employee back when I had founded it and was still a student. And then after 6 years of working together, she finally fell in love with me. So,
Well, so
took just a little bit.
You founded it as an undergraduate student at the University of Michigan. The first contribution that made you know this is actually going to happen came from a one-time $10,000 contribution from the president of the World Bank, who happened to be a cellist. How did you get this idea that I'm going to write to these people and I am going to get the funding to do this?
Well, it's interesting because it's always tough. You can have a great idea, but then if you can't really materialize it and you can't realize those goals, it's only a dream. And so one of the things that I'd always done is I always think that, it's important to do very focused outreach, but sometimes just kind of this shotgun approach, just put it out there and see if someone responds. And so as part of that side, I sent out about 120 letters to a variety of different people thinking, maybe someone might respond. And as I was looking at who should I write to, and different celebrities and musical celebrities, leaders in, diversity or in inclusion, I thought, well, you don't get someone who has access to more money than the president of the World Bank. And in addition to that, I knew he was a cellist. So I figured, well, why not write the letter and see what happens? And lo and behold, a few months later, I got a return envelope that was even half-sized. And it said, enclosed, please find this check and a one-time contribution. And I would say the important thing to add to that is, while initially he did say a one-time contribution, I very gently, after the first year, asked him if he would consider continuing that support on the part of their foundation. And they did for many years.
Wow.
And it had a huge impact on Sphinx, and especially in its early days.
The University of Michigan has been at the forefront of inclusion and diversity issues literally for decades, so it sounds like the right place for you to be. But I'm thinking of something you wrote, someone you wrote about from high school, someone who really made an impact, and that's an English teacher who had you write what was called a destiny paper. Could you then see where you are today? I mean, was there anything in that destiny paper that saw you doing the sorts of things you are doing now?
It's a very interesting question, and it's Mr. Hinz played a huge role for me, and I think it was in part because he got us to think about our futures and about what does it mean to have destiny, and what are you able to self-determine versus what is determined for you. And so it was really a very powerful kind of thought experiment in many ways for me. And so my destiny paper, I actually ended up on the Supreme Court. So a little bit of a different path. But the interesting thing was that I was bringing about on the Supreme Court change that related to diversity in the country, especially myself being biracial. And unfortunately, because of that, in my destiny, it brought about this change. But I had to pay the ultimate sacrifice and
give up your solo performance career.
And I was actually assassinated in my destiny paper. I was very tragically oriented, I think, in my teenage years, and so I had to pay the ultimate price. Although our society was left for the better. So I
didn't know this was also a fiction writing project.
So it was, but it was really interesting to kind of delve into that, and I often reflect back on it and smile about some of those things that I thought about. And I would say one of the constants is a belief that I could make a difference in some way.
And you certainly have. You mentioned diversity a moment ago, and this is how you described yourself. I'm basically a white, black, Irish, Catholic, Jewish, Jehovah's Witness.
Yes.
Explain.
I have kind of this varied background. So I was born on, of all days, September 11th, 1970, in Monticello, New York, and I was given up for adoption when I was 2 weeks old. I was adopted by a white Jewish couple who were from Chicago, who were neuroscientists, and they already had a birth child, my older brother, who's also a scientist, who's a cellular biologist at Columbia. And so fast forward 31 years, really at the age of 14, I began searching for my birth parents. I just always was drawn to
Had a longing to know them?
Absolutely. I always, at that time, what was driving me was that I wanted to be able to look someone in the eyes and see myself. It was almost that simple. And so I was unsuccessful for many years. But then when I was 31, I was reunited with my birth parents. My birth father, who's black Jehovah's Witness, my birth mother, who's white Irish Catholic, who ended up getting back together and marrying and having another child, my full sister, who had the opportunity to grow up with them, and who now practices law in New York. So that led to, because not only did kind of growing up Jewish, but then being able to meet my birth parents and have their backgrounds also inform me. Me in my entirety, I am informed by all of these aspects.
You feel more complete, I'm guessing.
That make up, definitely, and it makes up who I am. So which in the end is a black, white, Jewish, Irish Catholic Jehovah's Witness.
The tragedy was that it was unacceptable for your parents to have married then, but they persevered.
Yeah, so actually in 1970, interracial marriage was still illegal in some states.
Hard to believe.
And so my maternal grandparents certainly didn't approve, and my mother was put in an unwed mother's home. And so it's all the more remarkable that 3 years later they were able to not only get together but build this incredible life that they've spent together.
You know, interesting that you should be adopted by neuroscientists who, I should mention, worked for a period at Hershey Medical Center in Pennsylvania.
Absolutely.
And in fact, you did some undergraduate work at Penn State, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But functional MRIs show that there's nothing better for the brain than musical instruction, than playing an instrument.
Absolutely. It has a profound impact, and there's a lot of research out now that also shows the impact on overall youth development and what significant arts curriculum will do for young people, especially low SES, low socioeconomic students, it can have a profound effect, not only as in comparison to other low SES students, but it can, in certain instances, actually overcome the achievement gap itself. So it is profound. And the way I actually started was my adoptive mother was an amateur violinist. And she kind of became reinvigorated when I was around 5 years old by the Milstein recordings of the unaccompanied Bach. And I instantly fell in love, and so I took it up when I was 5.
Wow. What was it, first sound, first touch of the violin?
Yes. I think in part it was watching my mom play, and also that this was a way that I could speak and be heard. I think often when I was growing up, I felt like I wasn't heard. And or that I had an inability to express who I was or what I was going through. And that often leads to frustrations, and especially as a teen who's going through and wrestling with, as I did, significant issues. The violin was this way that I could express myself and even express troubled times, but in a way that ends up being beautiful and that other people want to experience. And in many ways, it can give a window into your soul.
You talked about feeling isolated as a young person, and you also said that children who carry a violin are unlikely to carry a gun. So in terms of, bridging this achievement gap, wow, how important it could be to get instruments in the hands of kids who need them.
Absolutely. And it played a profound role in my life. There were times when I was very alone or ostracized, and actually when I was 10 and moved to Hershey, Pennsylvania, I found myself quite ostracized, and my violin often was this incredible place of solace and of comfort for me.
You said that prior to moving to Hershey, Pennsylvania, you'd grown up in New York City, that skin color was, in your view, really no different than eye color, and your whole worldview changed once you experienced Hershey. That's sad to hear.
Yeah, so it's interesting because, growing up walking around Manhattan and going to PS 183 and 92nd Street Y and seeing people of all colors and stripes and coming back home and white parents and a white brother, I literally saw skin color like eye color or hair color. It had no more of a distinctive nature for me. But when I was 10 and I moved to Hershey, the community that surrounded me taught me that color really does matter, and so in some ways it was a shock.
You said it was hell.
It in some ways it was. So one of the kids would do what they called the Afro clutch in school. I had a big afro, so they would come up behind me in school and go, "Let's give Dworkin the Afro clutch." So it was a bit frustrating, shall we say, and it was hard, but my violin was this constant that I could always go to. And because I had had this significant training, high-level training, it was an area I could go to that I had a strong mastery of. And that gave me confidence in at least one area of my life at that time.
You said a high level of training. You were actually taught by a very prominent Russian violinist.
Yes, Vladimir Grafman was my first teacher, and in some ways it was a long cross section because he taught some of the greats, including Joseph Gingold, who taught many of the greats like Joshua Bell and others, who are great soloists, and he also taught Stephen Ships, who ended up being my teacher at Michigan. So I ended up studying with my original teacher's student's student, but Mr. Grafman had a profound effect on me, and he would always say, because I would always want to talk and have excuses for what I was doing, he'd be like, "You no talk, you play."
You had this dream of a solo performance, and in fact you had visions of, through music, uniting Russia and the United States. I mean, those are the kinds of big plans you always had. How difficult was it for you to put that on the back burner, to put your time and energies into Sphinx?
Yeah, well, it was interesting because I did have this sense of guilt as I began to practice less and focus more on Sphinx. And I reached a very pivotal time where I actually sat down and was thinking about it, and I realized that Sphinx had become my primary instrument. The organization itself was my instrument, and in realizing that, and I came to the conclusion that I could bring about more change through Sphinx than through my own presence on stage. And that was profound, but when it happened, it was like a switch, and I no longer felt that guilt, and I think it's because I felt like my path had now been laid out and that there was clarity.
You know, that reminds me of Jane Goodall. Her love, her passion was in working in the field with primates, but she realized that she could communicate in a way that others couldn't, that could get the message that primates were worth saving. And I feel like you've made a similar sacrifice and are making similar progress. But speaking of progress, when you founded Sphinx almost 20 years ago, less than 2% of musicians performing in orchestras were Black and Latino combined. Today, it's only about 4%. So while you have doubled the diversity in America's orchestras, it's still only a measly 4% when, if you look at the U.S. population, 13.2% of Americans are Black.
Absolutely. And in some ways, that is just part of the reason why it's so critically important that Sphinx can not only continue, but continue to expand the work that it does, and also be an inspiration and a catalyst for other organizations and other institutions to add to the vibrancy and the rich texture that must comprise the performing arts field. On the one hand, we can look and we can say, this was great, we have made a difference, and we have in some areas significantly increased. Not just increasing that, but Sphinx alums have gone on to every single top 10 music school. It was pretty much unheard of for a Black or Latino solo instrumentalist to solo with an orchestra. That now happens almost 30 times every year with major orchestras around the country. There was no professional Black and Latino orchestra. There are now 2, and one that tours 15 cities every year. So there are a host of things that have occurred, but there's tremendous work, and Sphinx, no matter how successful its work is, can never fully address this issue. It must be addressed in full by the field itself. And that's why a key role for Sphinx is as a catalyst, and to provide the incentive, to provide the information, and to provide the motivation for all of those institutions in the field to take up this charge that we all will benefit from.
You know, you often quote Leonard Bernstein, composer Leonard Bernstein, who in 1947 in the New York Times said, basically addressed the issue of diversity in orchestras and says, this is something we need to work on now, 68 years later, and you're still working on it. So what needs to happen? I mean, how do you get this, you know, you've seen the kind of inclusion among African Americans and Latinos in sports and business and all other fields, but not to the extent you'd like to see it in music.
Yes, and unfortunately that is shared in a number of other areas of the performing arts as well. And it is unfortunate, and it is the reality that we're behind many other fields. And I would say kind of 2 things. That one, of course, the work of Sphinx and others must continue and be built, and be able to be resourced to the extent to have a significant impact. But all of the actors in the field, so our major orchestras, our schools of the performing arts, where I now have the direct responsibility. I can't look over my shoulder and say, why aren't you guys doing this? I've got to be doing it myself. Is that inclusion must be one of our top priorities. And for too long, and currently, for example, in the orchestral field, far too many orchestras do not have the issues of diversity and inclusion as a priority, let alone a top priority. And so I've called on orchestras to look at the financial commitments and investments that they make in inclusion and diversity. How do they look at their systems that engage audiences, that engage the membership of the orchestra, that engage their staff in terms of recruitment, so that they really are looking at this seriously? You can look at football, which has the Rooney Rule, so where it looked and said, this is of importance to us, how we look at our coaching or how we look at key leaders in our sector? And do we need to have initiatives in place that will specifically address this? And unfortunately, for example, in the orchestral world, there are no field-wide initiatives like that that have been put in place.
How do you feel, or how do you respond to critics who say that this inclusion negatively impacts musical excellence?
Well, first I would direct them to any Sphinx concert and to the myriad of rave reviews from the New York Times to all other publications about the performances of our artists. So there is now an 18-year track record of not just one particular soloist that we may have nurtured, but literally a group of colleagues and peers across the country who have now entered the field in a variety of different ways. So first of all, there is just an example. But second of all, the idea that to be inclusive has the end result of reducing the quality of the output is simply untrue. And it hasn't been borne out in any other field. Yet those worries and fears were the same in all of these fields. It was there in business, it was there in law. Oh my gosh, if we do this, it will be a lower caliber. We won't be able to operate as we do as the, Coca-Cola company if we somehow are more diverse. Yet that is just obviously not the case. And on the contrary, when they've done these studies, especially when they look at, for example, the S&P, they have found that those companies that are more inclusive perform better and bring a better result to their shareholders. And so all of the evidence is to the contrary.
You mentioned in 2013, though, and this is after 16 years of Sphinx existence, that your graduates or your school was not informed of auditions at major orchestras. And despite the fact that most orchestras have blind auditions, so they wouldn't know whether the performer was white, black, Asian, what have you.
Yeah, so, and this was part of kind of a major address that I did to orchestras, and I did it from the stage of Carnegie Hall because I wanted to hopefully make sure that they heard the message. And the reality is, and what my underlying point there was, that they are not taking the steps even that Bernstein did decades ago to look at issues of inclusion. And so, for example, if we are going to have a blind audition process, who are we inviting? How are we posting that? And so if you have,
So if your students never know about it, how can they audition
exactly.
for these
And if you have a
positions?
company that, say, resides in Detroit, Michigan, and less than 3% of its customer base is African American, and over 80% of the residents are African American, that company is going to live and breathe. How do we bring the community into our workforce? How do we bring them into our customer base? How do we market to them? What is it about the community that we must not be understanding so that we can engage with them? The company would take on the responsibility rather than just post and say, we posted a job opening, hey, if they didn't come, what are we to do? Right. And unfortunately, that has been the approach of the majority of American orchestras, which is to say, hey, we posted an audition. If they don't come, what are we supposed to do about it? And the reality is that the way that diversity and inclusion has been built in any field, and especially higher education, is by the initiative on the part of the institution to reach out and engage communities, to understand those communities.
You say that there are 3 orchestras that are getting it, and that's Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Baltimore.
Correct.
What are they doing that the others aren't doing?
So there are, one of the aspects is a minority fellowship program. So this is an example where a younger musician of color is able to sit with the orchestra and be able to get mock auditions, be able to gain that critical experience so that then they can go out and win, in the field we call it winning an audition, and win a standard audition. And so unfortunately those are very rare. But also, for example, the Pittsburgh Symphony actually putting plans into place and developing an initiative to address diversity. And I would say the Detroit Symphony is really one of the leading orchestras in the country that has looked at this issue and has had a consistency over decades of not only a fellowship program but also concert series looking to elevate the visibility by composers of color and a host of other activities.
Why does diversity matter? What difference would it make in the playing and the experience of listening to a symphony?
So there
Or
are
an
a
orchestra?
couple of aspects to that. So one is just artistic. Chimamanda Adichie, the Nigerian author, who had shared that the danger of a single story is not that it is untrue, but that it is incomplete. The artistic stories that many of our American orchestras are weaving are incomplete because they are not inclusive of so many of these other voices. Voices both in the interpretation of the music on stage and certainly voices in terms of the repertoire being performed. Less than 1% of all of the repertoire performed by American orchestras is by any composer of color. And so there is an artistic requirement that I believe we have to fulfill our art form. Separate from that, there's also pragmatic reality. Orchestras are residents in their community. They are in part supported and funded by their communities. If they don't embrace the full breadth of the communities in which they reside, I think that they will have greater challenges moving forward than if they looked to engage them.
Thank you, Aaron Dworkin, so much for talking with us.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Aaron Dworkin. For more information on the Sphinx organization, visit our website at conversations.psu.edu. I'm Patty Satalia. We hope you'll join us for our next Conversation from Penn State.
Production funding provided in part by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by viewers like you. Thank you.